Wow, what a song. It's great that we have songs to express our emotion, and that was a great song to do that, wasn't it? Good morning, church. It's good to be with you on this beautiful spring day, and those who are with us online, we are glad that you're here with us as well, and are hopefully encouraged by all that's said and done here this morning. I'm going to be looking at Acts chapter 13. If you want to turn to that text in a few minutes, we'll be looking at it. Acts chapter 13. When I was real young, we had at school what you called show and tell. Anybody remember show and tell? I don't know if they do that anymore. It was kind of dangerous because sometimes you might be bringing in a lizard or a snake or a frog or something like that. But show and tell is happening this morning. I got this little book to tell you about for just a minute. How many times have you studied the book of Acts? Probably you can't count how many times you've studied the book of Acts. And I'm going to tell you, every time I study it, I get excited about it every time. It's one of the most exciting books in the Bible that tells the beginning of the church, that tells the beginning of the preaching of the gospel and people being baptized and becoming Christians. And it's such an exciting book. I have in front of me here a book that's called Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Evidences. It's an excellent book for looking at defending Christianity. Excellent book. Sometimes I have it beside my bed and I'll just read a little bit out of it every night before I go to sleep. Excellent book. But in this book it talks about the historicity of Acts. And by the way, this book was written by Norman Geisler. He died about a year ago, but he was a professor of theology and apologetics here in Charlotte. Did you know that? And he wrote some 40 different books on Christian apologetics that are excellent books to read on defending Christianity. But in this book, under the topic of the book of Acts, it talks about how awesome the book of Acts is. In fact, he shows all of these details that Luke wrote in the book of Acts that are so important to show us that Luke was really there and these things really happened and these places and people all really existed. This book talks about the geography, the Roman law, the travel routes, the cultural aspects, the religious practices, the local languages, and so many details are found in the book of Acts that if Luke was making a mistake on any of those, we would say, hey, this guy didn't know what he was writing about. But he always has all these details. In fact, this book lists 43 details of the sort I just mentioned, 43 details that are found in the book of Acts that show that this writer was really there, that these things really happened. And then in the conclusion on this article in the book of Acts, it says this, and I just want to read it before I begin the message today. The historicity of the book of Acts is confirmed by overwhelming evidence. Nothing like this amount of detailed confirmation exists for any other book from antiquity. Did you get that point? Nothing like this amount of detailed confirmation exists for another book from antiquity. This is not only a direct confirmation of the earliest Christian belief in the death and resurrection of Christ, but also, indirectly, of the gospel record, since the author of Acts, Luke, also wrote a detailed gospel. This gospel directly parallels the other two synoptic gospels. The best evidence is that this material was composed about AD 60, only 27 years after the death of Jesus. This places the writing during the lifetime of eyewitnesses to the events recorded. This does not allow time for an alleged mythological development by persons living generations after the events. Luke proves itself overwhelmingly as a middle first century document, close to the time period of the death and resurrection of Christ. Certainly during the time period of eyewitnesses of the death and resurrection of Christ. What an awesome book the book of Acts is. And this morning we're going to talk about just one of the chapters, part of one of the chapters in the book of Acts. One of my favorite chapters. And there's a whole bunch of them. I even love the shipwrecks at the end. Luke gives so much detail about the shipwrecks that you know he was actually sailing. It's awesome. But I can get too excited about it, can't I? In the 13th chapter, the Apostle Paul is on the first missionary journey. There we go. Well, he's on the first missionary journey. Like they often did, they started in Antioch of Syria. Syria's in the news a lot, isn't it, today? Yeah. Antioch of Syria. You know, Israel's down here. This is Syria area. Antioch was where a large church was established in the 11th chapter of the book of Acts. And then they sent out missionaries. They sent people out as missionaries. In chapter 13, they sent Paul and Barnabas on this missionary journey. And you see that they went to Cyprus. Then they went up north to Attalia, Perga, and they went up the river, and then they got up in the mountains, and they crossed over the mountains to Antioch of Pisidia. A lot of cities in New Testament times were named Antioch because, you know, one of the generals of Alexander the Great was Antiochus, and they ruled in this area, and so cities were named after him. Antioch of Pisidia, also known as South Galatia. And in the Bible, in the New Testament, you have a letter that's written to churches in Galatia, in this area, right? But they come to Antioch of Pisidia. And here's a description of some things about Antioch of Pisidia. It was the Roman colony city. So it was very important in that area. It supported and defended the Romans' authority in this area. It had civil and administrative rule in that area. It had a large Gentile population, including a Roman military that were stationed there. And it had a large, significant Jewish community. So when the Apostle Paul traveled, he often picked out these very important cities as being places where he would preach the gospel to both Jewish people first and then Gentiles as well. And that's what we find in Antioch. In chapter 13, Paul goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he gets the opportunity to raise his hand and stand up and preach the gospel. And that's what he does. And we get to read it, and it's one of the most I'm too excited this morning about the book of Acts. It's one of the most fantastic messages in the book of Acts because it tells the story of the Bible, the scheme of redemption, the plan that God had for saving us and how He fulfilled it in Jesus Christ. This message here is fantastic. It might not be too bad for all of us to memorize it. But we're going to skip over some of it. My notes keep blowing down for some reason. But Paul went to Antioch of Pisidia, Paul and Barnabas. This is the main street going out the west side of the city at that time. This was a theater that was there in the city at Paul's time. It could hold 12,000 to 15,000 people. Isn't that something? Concord, North Carolina doesn't even have that. And these are the ruins of the synagogue. Isn't that exciting? Luke says that Paul went to synagogue there and he preached the gospel. By the way, was there a synagogue there? Did Luke really know what he was talking about? Did he? Well, archaeology says yes. Yes, he knew. And Paul said this, beginning in verse 26. Brethren, sons of Abraham's family, that is Jewish people there in the synagogue, and those among you who fear God. Often there were Gentiles that would go to synagogue too, and they were called the God-fearers sometimes in the Bible. To us the message of this salvation has been sent. And it's been sent to you too. Some of you heard it and obeyed it, and you're Christians. And if you're not a Christian this morning, we hope that you're willing to investigate this message of salvation that God planned for you. For those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers, recognizing neither Jesus, him, nor the utterances of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, fulfilled these by condemning him. They fulfilled Psalm 2, where God's anointed one would be rejected. They fulfilled Isaiah 53 that said he would die for our sins. They fulfilled these prophecies by condemning him. And they found no ground for putting him to death. And they asked Pilate that he be executed. And when they had carried out all that was written concerning him in those prophecies, they took him down from the cross and laid him in the tomb. His crucifixion fulfilled the awesome prophecies found in Psalm 22 about the crucifixion of Christ. They took him down from the cross and laid him in the tomb, but God raised him from the dead, Paul said. And for many days he appeared to those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, to his disciples, including the apostles. He appeared. The very ones who are now his witness to the people, and even testifying to the people to the point of dying for the message they were proclaiming, this message of salvation. And Paul says, and we preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers. You know, God made the promise to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob. He made the promise to them that through their seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. And that was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. We preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers. 2000 BC, that promise was made. That God has fulfilled this promise to our children, and that he raised up Jesus, as it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So Paul quotes from Psalm 2, which is a crucifixion psalm. And it's a psalm that's mentioning the resurrection of Jesus as well, because that's the day when God declared to the world, this is my beloved Son. As for the fact that he raised him from the dead, no longer to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. Throughout the Old Testament, there were these prophecies about the Messiah, who would be the descendant of David. Sometimes he's even called David in those prophecies. That he would come and rule and bring righteousness and peace. Those were the sure blessings of David. And therefore, he also says in another psalm, Psalm 16, you will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay. David wrote that psalm. He wrote that psalm about 1000 BC. And it's a psalm about someone dying but not undergoing decay because they come back to life. And I want to tell you, that psalm was not about David, even though he wrote it. It wasn't about him. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, there's a good thought. He fell asleep as David died and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. But he whom God raised did not undergo decay. That's Jesus. Jesus was the fulfillment of the promise of Psalm 16. And then Paul closes with these words. Therefore, let it be known to you, brethren, that through him forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. That's a gospel message. That's the good news. That Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures prophesied. That he rose from the dead according to the Scriptures prophesied. And that through Jesus there is forgiveness of sins. No more guilt. No more fear. Overcoming sin in my life. On my way to heaven. Jesus made that possible. This is the message of salvation that we celebrate in the Lord's Supper. Paul's simple message included these facts: the trial of Jesus, the execution, the crucifixion, the resurrection, fulfilled prophecies, eyewitnesses of it all, and the result, forgiveness of sins. And so in the Lord's Supper, we remember the sacrifice that Jesus gave for us. We realize that all of this was in fulfillment of the Father's plan. Our salvation was something planned and provided by God for us. And so as we partake of the Lord's Supper, let's remember that we are benefiting from the great message of salvation that God made possible.